UN formally admitted the new African state of Zimbabwe as its 153rd member. The former British colony of Rhodesia became independent last April after years of guerrilla warfare ended in elections for black majority rule. The winner of those elections, now Prime Minister Robert Mugabe, was present here at the United Nations today. Mr. Mugabe will see President Carter on Wednesday to discuss increased aid for his regime, which came into being with the support of the Carter administration. Mugabe's emergence has raised hopes of a new era of racial tolerance and democracy in Africa, now that a century of European colonialism is formally over. Tonight, the problems still facing Robert Mugabe in realizing that hope. Jim?
Robin, it's been 4 months now since Robert Mugabe took over the government of Zimbabwe. Some expected miracles. Zimbabwe overnight would become an economic and social paradise for the 7 million blacks who had suffered under white minority rule. Others predicted disaster, physically for the 220,000 whites in the country, economically and governmentally for the country as a whole. There were still others who saw it in political terms. Mugabe, a Marxist, would turn his nation into a hard-line communist state. Thus far, all predictions have been wrong. The 4-month result has been a mixture of progress and problems, and most important for a nation torn by war for over 12 years, peace. The problems? Internal political tensions with Joshua Nkomo, Mugabe's old guerrilla ally, which is making it difficult to set up an integrated, viable army. White flight at a rate of 1,500 a month, a situation exacerbated by the recent anti-government statements by the white former army commander, Peter Walls, and by the arrest of a Mugabe cabinet minister, Edgar Tukere, on charges of murdering a white farmer. Robert Mugabe is with Robin in New York. Robin?
Prime Minister, let's start with the last thing that Jim mentioned, a story that has been in the news recently, the arrest of Edgar Tukere on the charges of murdering a white farmer. That case is being seen here, at least, as an ultimate test of the principles you say the new Zimbabwe will embody. Do you see the case that way?
No, certainly I don't. I don't think it's any more of a challenge than any other case that of the same nature that the police have handled. They will handle this case in the same way. And I don't see any reason why it should differ from the other cases. Obviously, a minister is involved, but the minister is also subject to the law like anybody else, and it is up to the courts to prove whether the minister is guilty or not guilty.
And given even that he was one of your associates during the long guerrilla struggle, that he's the general secretary of your political party, that he has a strong political following in the country, do you have confidence that he can receive a trial like any other person?
Yes, certainly. And he's willing to subject himself to a trial like anybody else. There is no question of our having it otherwise. We feel that if the police have made out a case against any one of us, it is only right and proper, fair to the particular person charged, and also fair to the people, that the minister subject himself to a trial.
Given that the victim of the crime, whether Mr. Tukere turns out to be guilty of it or not, given that the victim was a white farmer, does that not add a special dimension in the politics of Zimbabwe today?
Some people would want to see it, of course, as a different case, or a case falling in a different category, because one, a minister is involved, and secondly, a white man is involved as the victim. But as far as we are concerned, the situation is that there is a charge which has been made, and there is a victim who suffered death, and that victim could have been a black man. Actually, part of the charge is attempted murder, which centers around the fact that 3 other people were also going to be victims, but these are 3 blacks. And so the case is not just exclusively centered on the one aspect of a dead white man. It is also centered on 3 others who, it is said, would have become similar victims. And as far as we are concerned, whether a white man dies or a black man dies in circumstances that lend themselves to a charge, the charge must be the same.
Have you taken any special pains yourself to say to the justice authorities in this case, make sure that justice is done and is seen to be done, because it is especially important that it is seen to be done?
I haven't said so in respect of other charges, and naturally I won't say so in respect of this charge, but I have said it in general, that the law must take its course, and that the case must come to court without any let or hindrance by anybody.
The other dimension of Mr. Tukere is, of course, that he is one of those of your government who has spoken out for a rather more rapid pace of radical change socially and economically, whereas you have chosen what's described as a more moderate and slower course of change. Do you have the political strength to continue at your own pace?
I don't know Edgar Tukere to have made any proposals about any radical changes different from those which we are undertaking at the moment. Whatever changes we are having to make are changes that fall within the programs that are agreed by our Central Committee as a whole, and not just changes out of my own mind. And then they translate themselves into programs which the Cabinet must implement. This is how we operate. There's no question of Edgar Tukere being more radical than any other minister on these issues. None whatsoever, and I don't know of any proposal of his which can be said to be any more radical than the proposals of other ministers.
But you wouldn't deny that you have chosen a fairly moderate and slowly paced course of change.
No, we haven't done that. When you say I have chosen, again, you are not ascribing the change or the pace to me as a person, but it's my government, you see, which is embarked on a course which requires that we take into account the priorities which need our attention, first and foremost. And as we see things, what we need first and foremost is the consolidation of our independence. The forces that fought each other yesterday must now look at themselves as allies and work to consolidate peace and independence. Then secondly, there are those areas which are most urgent, where attention is required immediately, such as the resettlement of our displaced persons and providing them with more land, which we are doing, getting schools back into function, building more schools, repairing those which were damaged, more hospitals, repairing more those which were damaged, and extending the services in that way. This is what we are doing, and it's being done quite fast. I don't see how anybody could have done it otherwise. First, we must have peace, and only in the atmosphere of peace can we embark on any program to transform the country.
Do the masses who were your followers and voters in the election think that you were doing it fast enough?
Yes, there are no complaints, really. None. The only complaints I'm getting are from journalists and reports. You see, abroad, back home, people are not complaining about a lack of progress. In fact, they're very happy that government has proceeded in the manner in which it has done. You see, already education is free up to the primary school. Already the health service is free for the majority of the people, those of them who do not earn more than $150 a month. And already land is being allocated to people. There is peace in the area as a whole, in spite of the small incidents that remain to be taken care of. And there is advancement in the public service. We have now, for the first time, at the head of departments of government, Africans as secretaries. This never happened before. And the army is being integrated as fast as can be.
Well, thank you. Jim?
Mr. Prime Minister, another case that's been in the news recently involves General Walls. He resigned, as you know, as head of the Army, and he had some bad things to say about you, saying that your electoral victory was brought about by intimidation, among other things. I understand it now that you would like for General Walls to leave Zimbabwe. Is that right, sir?
What I've said is that the statement he made betrayed his true feelings, and that if in fact that's what the nature of man General Walls is, then he hasn't got a place in our society. In other words, he should find a home elsewhere.
Will you help him find a home? In other words, will you urge him?
Yes, as quickly as possible.
I see. Where is he now? I saw a report today that he had gone to South Africa and was now back in Zimbabwe. Is that correct? He's back in Zimbabwe now?
I think so, yes.
Have you taken steps now to get him out of the country?
No, but it's absolutely necessary that he be assisted to get out and find a home elsewhere.
I see. Yeah. What was his job? He was put in charge of the Army on a transition basis for a year, is that right? To try to integrate the guerrilla forces of yours and Joshua Nkomo's plus the existing Army. Is that what he was to do?
Yes, that's the main task with which I charged him. But he was not to work alone. He was to work alongside the Zanla commander, the Zipra commander, the commander of the former Rhodesian Army, and the Air Force commander. And this is the pattern which we had established for purposes of bringing about a quick integration of the Army. But the Army, of course, that had to be integrated was Zanla, the ZANU Army, Zipra, the ZAPU Army, and the former Rhodesian Army.
Mm-hmm. That's not going very well, is it, the
integration? It's going well now. Mm-hmm. I think the main hurdle at the beginning was lack of instructors to undertake the retraining program. But we have had, we now have these instructors. We have had to train them ourselves, and they're doing very good work, and the battalion is being turned out every fortnight.
I see.
That's not bad.
On the General Walls case, do you think he has much of a following among the whites in Zimbabwe?
Whatever the situation is, he's an enemy of the country. Whether he has a following or doesn't have it, I don't think he has a place in our community.
I see. The figure that I've read here, again, as you say, reports from outside journalists, but the figure I read today was that since you took office, some 5,000 whites have left the country. Is that basically a right figure?
Well, that's the statistical figure which they give us, that some 5,000 or thereabout have left the country since our independence.
Why have those people left, sir?
I cannot say, but I think some of them just cannot accept the reality of an African government. They are racist in character, and naturally to them or to their type, we say good riddance. Others are perhaps frightened, and we are sorry about those ones. We are sorry for them, really, because they needn't be frightened about us. Our policy is one of trying to accommodate everybody and to ensure that all people are treated equally on a non-racial basis. That is the category of people we are sorry about. Others are probably young men in their 30s or 40s who are not quite sure whether they have a guaranteed future in the country. Again, they have certain concerns and fears and would want to establish themselves as quickly or as early in their life as possible.
Are you trying to give these people a guarantee about their future if they stay?
Oh, we have tried to give them all the assurances possible, namely that we are not going to discriminate against any person on grounds of color or race, and that whites have a place and a role to play in our society.
What role would that be?
Well, a normal role, depending on the skills which a person has.
What about you're in your budget, you have decided not to increase, as I understand it, the tax rate in the upper income brackets. And this was interpreted here again by outside journalists as a gesture on your part to these very whites that, look, you're not out to get them, you're not out to get them. Is that what you meant by that?
Well, certainly yes. We do not want to make them feel that they are being discriminated against merely because they belong to the upper income group. And if we're to levy onerous taxes on them, it might force them out of the country, or at least to reduce their earning capacity, or the income that remains after the deductions. And they might feel that this is unfair, it is discrimination, it is aimed at the whites, and that government is therefore not well disposed towards the whites.
Thank you, Robin.
Prime Minister, you're going to see President Carter on Wednesday, and you've already said publicly that you're going to ask for more aid from the United States. Why is the aid the United States has offered so far, $20 million this year, 25 to 30 million next year, not enough?
Obviously, it isn't enough. If you take that and pit it against the sum which the British and the Americans were talking about at the time of the Anglo-American proposals, $1 billion, you will realize that a mere $25 million or even $100 million falls far short of the target of $1 billion, which we would require over a period to undertake effectively our development program.
Do you feel that Britain and the United States have reneged on the promises they were making when they wanted you all to sign the ceasefire agreement and to come into line?
I think other factors have intervened, which probably have made it difficult for them to make as much contribution as they would have made, say, 1978 or 1979, if we had got our independence then. I also believe that perhaps the fact that the original promise was made between the Carter government here, Carter administration, and the Labour government in Britain, was responsible for the original figure. And with the Conservative government now in Britain, I think the tendency has been to regard that earlier promise as unrealistic, as one which the Labour government went into with the American administration. But I would want to feel that even though the will to give might exist, perhaps the realities of the economic situations in the two countries, and also the realities of a political situation in the United States, might be responsible for the reduced amounts.
Zimbabwe, the former Rhodesia, is one of the best endowed nations in Africa in terms of resources and has one of the most promising and partly developed economies. Why do you need more aid? What would you use it for?
That also is another factor. People look at our infrastructure and say, well, in terms of that economic infrastructure, we are better developed and more advanced than other economies in Africa. And we probably are not the worst beggars in Africa. There are others who are worse than ourselves. And why should we be seen to be requesting for concessionary loans or for grants?
Why should you?
Well, certainly that's the question. Why should we? Our country has gone through a very protracted period of armed struggle and of sanctions imposed against the regime, and there's been destruction to part of the infrastructure. I was talking a while ago of schools that went into disrepair, schools that were closed, hospitals that ceased to function, and of the need, therefore, to bring about the reconstruction of our economy. We have to repair our economy, and we need funds. Then there is the question of the population, nearly 2.5 million to 3 million, who were displaced because of the war. They have to be resettled. We need land. We need money for capital equipment. Those are some of the needs we feel, and there is no country which is in that most difficult position at present than ourselves.
How much of that need do you hope will be filled by private investment in your country, and how much by government aid?
Well, see, private investment chooses where it wants to go. It chooses where it benefits it most to invest. It could be in the mining sector, it could be in the industrial sector, it could be in the agricultural sector. And so you cannot force it to
build new schools.
Yes, to build new schools, to go public, as it were, to take the same direction as government. And this is the reason why we want aid from well-disposed countries, which we can utilize for purposes of public schemes, which are not quite the thing for private enterprise.
Do you include the Soviet Union among well-disposed countries?
The Soviet Union has not yet indicated to us its position regarding aid, but we have made our appeal to everybody, including the Soviet Union. But we hope, as and when it establishes its mission, we shall talk about aid quite positively.
Thank you. Jim?
Thank you.
Mr. Prime Minister, why has the Soviet Union not established an embassy yet in Zimbabwe?
Well, it's entirely up to them. We have invited them to send a delegation to discuss the question of their establishing a mission there. Mm-hmm. And if they would want to, they're welcome to establish one. Wow. But of course, there are a number of things we would want to discuss with them, just as there were things we had to discuss with other governments before they established their missions. There are certain requirements we expect of a government or a state which establishes its mission on our territory, and we would naturally also want to discuss those requirements with the Soviet Union.
It sounds to me, sir, like there's something specifically that's bothering you about the Soviet Union. Is there?
No, nothing extraordinary. Mm-hmm. But relations have got to be discussed before they are established, and we haven't discussed them.
I see. Mm-hmm. Well, as you know, as you may not know, the reports here in the United States have said that one of the reasons you've been reluctant to push ahead on establishing a relationship with the Soviet Union is because the Soviet Union helped out Mr. Nkomo during the guerrilla warfare rather than your side of the Patriotic Front. Is there anything to that?
No, that's not the reason, really. There were quite a number of socialist countries which were better disposed towards ZAPU than ourselves. But we have, upon discussing the question of establishing relations with them, allowed them to go ahead and have embassies. The Soviet Union hasn't done that.
I see. How would you characterize your relations right now with South Africa?
The relations that exist between our country and South Africa are those we have inherited. They are mainly in the sphere of the economic sphere, and they have to do with our trade. They have to do with the exportation of our goods, the use of the transport system that passes through South Africa, and these naturally we will retain because it would be unrealistic and it would be suicidal for us to try and stop them. So we can't savor that type of relation with South Africa. Then there are political and diplomatic relations. Well, we do not see these emerging at all. Our belief is that South Africa must not be associated with politically and diplomatically because of its apartheid philosophy, that the international community has a duty to pressurize on South Africa to bring about positive change in its system so there can be established true democracy in the territory. And in our small way, we would want to add to the pressures of the international community by denying South Africa relations in the political and diplomatic fields.
But you have to continue economic relations. Is that what you're saying,
Yes,
sir?
economic relations will continue, certainly.
Would you hope to eventually sever those as well?
I don't think you can sever completely relations with your neighbors, even if your neighbors are bad neighbors. Mm-hmm. But I think you can reduce your dependence on a bad neighbor.
Mr. Prime Minister, we just have a few seconds left. Everybody else has talked about what you've accomplished in 4 months. In a word, how do you feel about how you have performed and how Zimbabwe has performed since you've been Prime Minister?
I think we have done very well indeed. We inherited a situation which had all kinds of contradictions, some of them very antagonistic indeed. The whites were hostile to the blacks and the blacks hostile to the whites. And within the blacks, they had been developed a certain group of puppets who worked against the interests of their own people. But these groupings no longer exist, and we have managed to instill into our population a sense of oneness and common loyalty.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. Good night, Robin.